issues, science, geopolitics, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Pretty good. Good to see you, Pierce.
Good to see you. So today we're going to be talking, this is episode 8, we'll be talking about video game addiction, contracts, incremental change, and much more. In lieu of our good news story today, we're going to do a little bit more housekeeping. Apologize for that, but everyone should know for our Spotify listeners, we are releasing, we are trying to catch up on releases on Spotify, and we are still working on Apple Tunes. We are up on Instagram. We have Twitter now. All of those will be in the description. In the YouTube, our link tree has all of those links for you to go to that. Patreon will be forthcoming as well. Yes, and so that's what I wanted to do as far as housekeeping goes. Do you have anything for us on that, Richard?
I think I'm ready to go.
Awesome. So just to recap for any of our listeners who are joining without hearing the previous episode, we were just wrapping up polyvagal theory, our part 2 of it. We had been discussing addiction, and we're going to keep in line with that addiction series a little bit more loosely today. But polyvagal theory was essentially about relating how our brain in different states reacts to agitation or exogenous effects from our environment based off of traumatic or just our past lived experiences, and how that's changed our ability to regulate our system well, or balanced, or what would be balanced.
Mm-hmm.
It's changed, and it's made it so that states that would usually be healthy during small portions of our day have been made longer, where we're in higher stressed states for longer periods of time during events that possibly shouldn't be as stressful to someone who has a decently regulated HPA axis. So that's my terrible summary. Richard, you want to put a better bow on it?
Well, let me add to what you said and say that the polyvagal theory addresses the central and peripheral nervous system. The vagus nerve is a part of our peripheral nervous system that travels throughout the body in the thorax and the abdominal cavities. It connects to our end organs in the body, such as the heart, the lungs, the digestive tract. And according to the polyvagal theory, the vagus nerve is not just one continuous branch of nervous system tissue. It's two. It's a dorsal or back of the body nerve, and it's a ventral front of the body nerve. And the mechanism of this nervous system structure is to send information from the body back to the brain. And the brain can send information back down the vagus nerve as well, but the bias is towards sensory information coming in from the body. And when I make these gestures about our body, I'm going to include the eyes and the ears and the skin as also sensory organs for what's happening and what the vagus nerve is interpreting from the environment.
With the vagus nerve. Oh, sorry.
Yep, exactly. If we were an autonomous robotic device or a car, this is the idea of all the sensors.
Yep.
And
that's exactly what I was going to say. Cameras and sensors and all that other cool gadgetry, right? And lasers poking out. Yeah.
And so what the autonomic nervous system, that's what I've just described, the vagus nerve is the autonomic part of the autonomic nervous system. What it's seeking are signals of safety or signals of threat. And what puts us into a pro-social mode where we can rest and recover and digest is a dominance of signals of safety. And what puts us into activation or sympathetic mode to deal with a problem are signals of threat. And then the last thing I'll say is that now that I've said all of that, there are some interesting paradoxes that also fit into this theory that describe what happens when we might be shown signals of safety, but they are interpreted as threat because of a traumatic natural history, or that instead of going into activation to handle some type of emergency, we shut down. And so that's the other paradox of the way that the theory addresses all these different states the nervous system can be in. There you go. There's my my addition to what you said.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you for that. That was better and more concise. So, yeah, in going that line, a lot of what we were talking about is essentially um like having a robust signal and something that can handle like the normal day-to-day exogenous effects of the universe we live in, right? And I think it's funny, we were using a river flowing or a tributary as some form of an analogy. And one of the things that I was thinking about with that is that river is the time and energy of space and time that goes into your own life. And like it never stops. As long as you're alive, you're breathing, this
Mm-hmm.
that day is continuing, you're going to get more piled on. And a
Yeah.
well-regulated, a well-developed person, someone who is low on their trauma count or has addressed their trauma, has created a very healthy, and they did this not by themselves, they did this with a good, healthy, some type of healthy network structure in their development, right? Good parents, hopefully both. I mean, that would be ideal, but at least one, maybe a good grandparent, good feedbacks, systems of feedback that allow this person to create healthy levees and control systems for the river that is the universe coming in, if we're sticking with this analogy.
Mhm.
And so one of these things, and maybe it's tied to deep to Christian values or something, archaic in the past, a historical remnant of the way America raises its children. But this idea of hard times makes hard men and soft times makes
Mhm.
soft men, or whatever,
Mhm.
one of these sayings. And I remember saying this to my wife before we had our kid, like, oh, I'm going to be tough on our sons to make them tough and get them ready for the world, right? And my brilliant
Yeah.
wife at the time was like, I said the hard times hard, and she just looked at me as someone looks at you at someone who is just spouting off a saying and not really looking deeper than just the saying and what it was. And she said, that's not true. She's like, hard times break men. It makes
Yeah.
broken things. And the only ones you see are the ones who managed, despite the hard times, that managed to survive the breaking. Really, and I could think, and just to add on that real quick, is the idea of the Spartan lifestyle, right? Like if anybody actually understands what happened to the Spartans, they died out as a clan because they were so hard and so brutal
Yeah.
to their children. Like it wasn't a successful. Those men weren't men to emulate. That wasn't a family structure to emulate. It was a low birth rate, family destroying, clan destroying lifestyle, and it eventually destroyed them as an idea, until we brought it
Mhm.
back and started to idolize it. So I know there was a lot there, and I kind of transitioned, but I thought that would be an interesting starting point. Is this hard times makes hard men?
I like the way that you
Philosophy.
described your wife's reply to your observation. She hit you with that statistical math reply. Like,
Without any
no,
math.
yeah, without any math. No, what you're seeing is the survival bias. That's not what you're not seeing the reality of this. You're just picking up with the survival bias. And for listeners who um, if you ever stumble across this example, I'll talk about it briefly here, and that is that during World War II, aircraft that were flying over Europe and performing bombing missions would come back pretty damaged. They'd be shot up, and there'd be
Catch
holes in
22.
the fuselage. Yeah, so of course in the mid-century we had the survival bias idea of how to study this damage, and they the engineers and technicians wanted to harden the aircraft to make them more increase their survivability. And, they would look at where they were shot up and say, well, we should probably armor these places because there's bullet holes here or there's shrapnel holes. When the reality is that no, the airplanes that didn't come back, that's where the actual hardening and resiliency is to be put down. Not these things can fly still with the holes in them. It's fine. The ones that didn't come back, we need to study those or assume where they must have been shot that they didn't return. Yeah, so she issued with the survivor bias statistics.
Yeah, very funny, right? Like I live in the Bay
Mm-hmm.
Area right here, where I would say, it's I live in Little India, which is within Little China, and then it's next to Little Korea. And if you were to come here, you would probably think that all Asians and Indians are the smartest people ever, and like, but really what you would be
Mm-hmm.
getting is the largest, and I'm not saying that they're not, I'm just saying there's a large conglomeration of STEM-based people in the Bay Area in general,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's a very biased area as far as probably IQ. If you were to come down here, like
Mm-hmm.
you would see some of the craziest averages along those lines. You'd see some
Yeah.
of the craziest averages of money. More money is in the Bay Area than anywhere in the planet, right? So like,
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason why property values are so crazy down here. Uh, Antithetical to that, you have LA, which probably has the lowest IQ on the planet. Just a joke there, but very good looking. They're very good looking down there in LA, so they've got that going for them. So that's all in the same state too. By the way, it's really funny. Really smart
Oh,
in the north,
man.
really dumb and pretty in the south. So what can you say?
RIP to your social network, your social media accounts.
I'm not gonna get added by any celebrities. Well, dang it. It's all right. Um, God, I completely digressed us off the rails there, but
Well,
yeah,
one of the things I wanted to mention when you were talking about a person's tendency towards resiliency, the technical language or technical jargon that I've been working with to kind of get my mind around it for myself has been secure attachment. So hard times produce survivors that give us a bias of who emerged from them. But really, when we look at what biologically is important or significant or healthy or beneficial to human beings, it has more to do with the secure attachment concept. Because that secure attachment gives us resiliency around uh, confronting or handling or processing through difficult experiences. And you refer to people having a strong social network of some kind, and that goes to this idea called co-regulation. And so, with regard to attachment and co-regulation, you can see how they're synergistic ideas. They go together. If you have one, you probably have the other. They might suggest the existence of the other. So, it's the scenarios we could reel off are going to be things like, okay, a childhood experience is adverse in some way. I don't care which one you pick one. And there's a secure attachment with caregivers, and there's co-regulation. So the child experiences the frightening or fracturing event, but um, because of the responsive facial features and prosodic speech and I don't know any number of
touch.
dozens of
Yeah,
indicators,
I've got a perfect one.
touch.
Any every day with my son who is not 2 yet, Kian. He he's not 2, so um, things can scare him really easily. Things that you would never
Yeah,
even imagine scare. Taking
yeah,
something abruptly from him too quickly,
yeah.
like if his older brother, grabs a bubble machine from him,
Mm-hmm.
he panics and it can scare him. He can look around and he's upset, immediately starts screaming really loud, crying, whatever. Um, what me or my wife can do is run up to him and we're like, "Oh, are you okay?" We use soft tones. "Oh, that's okay. It's okay. Did
Yeah.
Ronan take that? That's fine." We pick him up, we give him a hug, we hold him a bit, he squeezes. talk to him a little bit, he breathes, he down regulates, which is very important for the polyvagal theory. I believe Stephen Porges talks about breathing is so huge into like
It
quick
is.
regulation theory. That's like
Mhm.
that's like one of the most basic and simple tactics. Everyone's been told to just breathe when they calm down when they need to. Telling someone to calm down doesn't help, but breathing that could help. So yeah, with your kid, that's exactly the scenario, that he experiences all the time. I mean, for things that seemingly would be mundane to you and me, like, oh, that your kid takes a book out of his hand, no big deal. But to a 2-year-old, to somebody who's not even two yet, that's a big deal. Like something was snatched from him, ownership was snatched, whatever, you know. So that was just my ad.
It, your kids are going through the different stages of developing object permanence and different stages of when something changes abruptly in their life, as you just described in this scenario, that that what is permanent and what is reinforced and what is validated constantly is their existential and intrinsic value in the world. And when you're able to comfort them, that's what you're establishing with them, is that regardless of all these other things that are ephemeral in their world, what is unshakable is the connection, the attachment, and the co-regulating environment that you and your spouse are providing to them. And if that's present, what we understand about the human nervous system now is that sets us up for an unbelievable amount of success around resiliency later in life, because we're gonna get tackled on football fields and knocked down. We're gonna, our cars are gonna get scraped in parking lots. There's going to be breakups with significant others. There's all these things that will occur over the next 25 years of that child's life that they're building towards, and the shape of their finished brain at 25, that if those all come together in the way that I'm describing as securely attached and co-regulating, then they end up with this mature brain that has that exists in equanimity. It exists in a balance that allows them to be pro-social more of the time, to see more cues of safety more of the time than cues of hazard or danger.
A dynamic
And they're
HPA axis, very dynamic, being able to
yeah,
like adjust to the exogenous, internally regulate
yeah,
despite what exogenous, whether it's extreme exogenous effects to you or small, just day to day, like you said, mundane challenges. You know,
yeah,
one thing that I'm reminded when you're saying that, I remember school was a great trigger for being super stressed out, right? Especially like
yeah.
during finals week or something. And especially the first couple of years where I was still juggling my video game addiction, my family,
Mm-hmm.
everything else. Like there were times I was just not prepared for the test as I should have been prepared, right? Those times where I was studying but playing video games in between studying. And so I wasn't good studying, but I would justify it. I got some studying in. Um, when it was finals week, I was a terror to be around because
Yeah.
all of a sudden all of um, my past traumas that had caused the addictions were there in inflicting stress upon my life, undue
Mm-hmm.
stress, really. And then I was being at this heightened state, the yellow state, the whole
Mm-hmm.
time, just, and you don't want to be in the yellow state when you're trying to do a bunch of math problems and calculus and differential equations and physics, heat transfer too. You don't want to be doing, you don't want to be in that state. Like if I'm playing tennis, sure, I absolutely want to have the adrenaline pumping. I want to be, I want to be alacritous. I want to be able to have
Mm-hmm.
coordination. I want to have strength when I hit that ball. But dang, I don't want to be doing that when I'm trying to, do some tricky algebra. Like,
I was talking to one of the students of the program that you graduated from. I'm involved in. Had a terrible test session in one of the chemistry classes, and was talking with me about it. And he wasn't ranting or raving about it. This is one of our fellow vets, and you know some days I'm better than others, and I'm able to actually really engage with a conversation like this. But ultimately, what I said to him was, when when we take exams in college, we're not taking the exam with the same brain we studied with. The brain we get when we get into that classroom for the exam is a degraded state of cognition and intelligence and memory and recall. It is a optimized state for danger, reactivity, and threat and mobilization, which is the opposite, as you just described, of the thing you need for doing calculus. You need a lot of creativity. You need a lot of recall of memorized features of the solution, the path to a solution.
I
Yeah,
need
totally.
I need my notes. Like there were
Mm-hmm.
so many different things, like things that would drive me crazy is when a teacher would be like, "You don't get notes for this test,"
Yeah.
right? And I understood what the teacher was
Mm-hmm.
trying to do in their archaic teaching style, by the way, when I am about to go to a job with a fucking internet and they're telling me I can't have a notepad of notes I wrote
I
myself
know.
to do the tricky problems. I need to memorize fucking equations.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm a child of the internet, for the love of God. I mean, I
Yeah.
might be an old ass millennial, but I had the internet by the time I was a teenager. You know, um, our
Yeah.
brains, my part of my brain developed around the ability to be able to search the answer out at the time and not have to
Mm-hmm.
memorize it like all the baby boomers did when they were going through school, which totally made sense for what they were doing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I just remember like the notepad, like these were there were all these things I needed to be secure when I would take the test, and at least I
Yep.
could kind of be in that state. I remember when we had COVID, suddenly test taking actually was a lot less nerve wracking because I wasn't like it felt like yeah, it was just not the same vibe. I was in the comfort of my house. I could be like, okay, I got my tea, I got all my, I just had everything ready for this test. It didn't really matter if I'm being observed by whatever application or whatever, as long as they said I could have note card or whatever, like
Yep.
I was fine. Um, and you're absolutely right. Being in that test scenario it's a freaking nightmare, I don't even now, like where I feel like I have healed a lot of my regulation ability. I feel like my signal is pretty robust in a lot of cases. There are certain areas where I have huge
Yeah.
deficits. Even now, like I'll get like I'm already talking about testing is making me feel a little bit tenser in the gut. I don't have a test coming up, but I'm
Yeah.
just like, God, do I have to take a test soon? You know.
And
So
this is a great example of you noticing your physiologic state changing because we're just talking about something that is activating or triggering.
yeah,
This is a huge key in everything we talk about. I always emphasize, oh, this is really important. Take note here. Well, here we go. Here's a great example of one of the ways out of this morass is technical understanding of what's going on, and then to develop a apparatus of awareness that is intentional, to notice when it's going on, and then to check in with the system. Oh, I'm in my office today having this conversation with you. There's nothing that's not safe. There's no risk here. There's no threat. So then I could say, all right, long out, long exhale. Okay, I'm back into a pro-social, co-regulating state with you,
yeah.
even though we're talking on a computer today. And the same can be true for yourself, because that's a skill set that you're developing. And for our audience, what I just said, that would be the enterprise I would offer to you to develop within yourself, is the ability to notice that your physiology has changed, certainly without your doing, that's autonomic,
Hmm.
and that you can intervene and then use breath to bring yourself back into a green state or a regulated rest and recovery and digestion state.
Yeah, it's funny because and I think I don't know if we've talked online about this, but I started to arrest my addictions, starting with I believe tobacco before any of them really, um, and then alcohol. Uh, it was really interesting for me because when you have a bunch of them built up, your autopilot mode is really strong. Like there's a lot of systems that you've just kind of you're not even physiologically aware. like I am
Mhm.
now. Like I can immediately tell. I'm like, oh, I'm feeling it now. But even a couple of years ago, I wouldn't have necessarily felt the same physiological. I would have been numb to those feelings. Um, and something about introspection actually, it, it's very incremental. Like it's harder to be introspective the more damage or weight you're carrying around, because
Yeah.
looking inward is painful, and I believe this is
Hmm.
your brain's defense mechanism from
Hmm.
probing around into the dark depths that it's really trying to kind of mask from you, right? For your own protection.
Hmm.
It's justification. Whether this your hippocampus working in conjunction with the amygdala and the hypothalamus and the polyvagal, all these systems here working on your memory to just kind of like and to autopilot your ass and just block like a lot of this shit happening at the time. So to add to that, I would say is like being a little bit of introspective to understand, to just be aware of something, I think is just it's a really good start. Just having some awareness about your state is a really tough thing early on.
Hmm.
I think if you're highly traumatized, your brain might be tuned to make you not introspective and aware of these things. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know necessarily how you start being so, other than being us telling you and you telling yourself to be mindful, like reminding yourself to be mindful and what that even means. Because it's kind of a philosophical question in some cases, like what does it mean to be mindful?
Yeah.
Because there's a spectrum of mindfulness.
Well, the fastest route for me has been through the dancing classes, the dance lessons, and the reason, or at least the reason that I'm going to make part of my narrative, is because I'm having to co-regulate with someone else, by virtue of the experience, by virtue of the enterprise of dance, by virtue of the design of the lesson. I have to be connected enough with this other person for that 45-minute, whatever, it could be an individual lesson or a group lesson, that during that time, the in the beginning, it's suppression. It's suppression of the impulses or instincts to, uh,
Run, freeze.
yeah, totally. Like all the survival, these are called animal survival strategies. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Call out to connect. All these different ways that people have characterized them, and it was, um, not. It was really unpleasant in the beginning. The fact that I stuck with it is a lot to do with the part where, um, I developed an understanding, within a couple of months, that what I was doing was going to my laboratory. So I would talk about something in a, individual therapy session, and then decide that I was going to work on some part of that in the lab. And this is totally socialized for you and I. We have classrooms and laboratories. We learn the theory over here. We go over here. We try it out. It doesn't work. Then we have to figure out why. Then we go back and try it again, and so forth. And so
You're
the
doing
dance
what any
studio,
scientist does. Sorry to interject, but uh,
yeah,
and by the way, scientists have been doing this forever, experimenting on yourself. Shit, like
yeah,
doctors still inject themselves first sometimes when they don't get to go to human trial. Not saying that they should. I'm just saying, yeah, you sometimes at the end of the day, you're your own experiment,
yeah,
and you found. I mean, you're the one who could kind of do all the tests on yourself and give yourself feedback as you go. So that completely makes sense, that you approach it this way.
yeah. I like. There's like nine things I want to talk about with the dance studio as a topic, and I'll just keep it to two today. But one of them was, um, as a product of the environment that I grew up in, the fawning behavior is really a default for me. It's to try to manage dangerous adults. We talked about it last couple episodes ago, and
Yeah.
it'll come up all the time.
What
So
will please them? What will please them?
totally,
Or keep them off my back? Please keep them
totally,
off my back. Yeah. Any strategy
whatever it
to
is,
evade the danger and whatever. And that could be a number of strategies, not just please. It's like, oh, in this case, I need to just, escape and or get them away from me or please. Yeah.
Distraction, it could be any number of things. And, I was in the studio one time dancing with one of the instructors, and I couldn't even tell you what I couldn't tell you what the marker was. She didn't shiver. She didn't go, "Brr, it's cold." But we got done with a combination in whatever we were doing, rumba or whatever it was, and I said, "You need your jacket back on." And she goes, "Okay, how did you know that?" And I said, "I don't know, but I have learned the word for it. It's called fawning." And that's not a superpower. I'm not one of the uncanny people with an X name. That's not what that is an example of how you tune into other people's disposition and um, modes of behavior and their countenance to figure out where you got to come in with your energy to keep the situation safe and civil. And so when I talk about this fawning behavior, Terry Real talks about this with his experience with dangerous adults, and that is that you're using a child's brain to manage people that are bigger and more powerful than you are and are proven to be unreliable. And in the scenario of the dance studio, one of the undoing projects that you're working on is undoing the drive, the existential drive to control the person that you're in frame with and you're dancing around doing foxtrot. You can't control them. In fact, the more you try, the worse it goes. And learning to decouple the fawning, literally controlling other people behavior that is a product of complex trauma is it's I've been doing this for 3 years now.
Yeah.
It's like last weekend I finally had the insight that that's what was going on, and I figured it out because the coach I was working with last weekend was talking about this very thing. And when we got done, I said to the instructor I was working with, not the coach, it was different. There was three of us there in this workshop.
Yeah.
I said, I finally have been given, I've finally been granted the freedom to release my need to control the situation in this regard, in this example. And when you're talking about these incremental movements of progress from um, inflexible and basically the definition of it's really easy to diagnose PTSD to someone who's well adjusted and flexible and nobody would know. So those 2 points are very far apart in increments.
Yeah.
And that example in the studio was like it took months and months. I had read how many different books by the authors that we talk about in this forum that have suggested these very things. That's not going to do it. But it took the experience of being there to do that with another person, co-regulated.
So this is really good. I love your story there because I'm reminded of incrementalism versus the payoff of incrementalism too.
Yeah.
So um, I heard this story. This is like third party, a different podcast. A psychologist was speaking of his guru, Indian guru. So he's a doctor, um, but he's Indian and he had a guru before he went and practiced Western medicine. So he's a Western medicine doctor who has some Eastern medicine influences in there because he did that before. Anyways, he had this great story that his guru had told him about when you're changing yourself, a lot of times, um, he's like, you could think of it as like when you're sowing fields. And he's like, and when you have a bunch of fields that you need to sow, you'll have this river that's right there. Now, a farmer who doesn't know better would start digging the row by the river or whatever, and then the river would come in and flood the field, and you wouldn't have any of your rows, you wouldn't have anything planted, blah, blah, blah. So
Yeah.
that's not what you want to do. But what you want to do is start at the other side of the farm, and you work your way back and forth the whole way. You plow all the fields up against the river, but you don't finish the plow at the very end because you want to incrementally change. And sometimes it could feel like you haven't done anything. You've been working on these fields for a couple months. You've been doing all this work. You're plowing all these fields. Nothing's growing yet because you haven't watered them
Mm-hmm.
yet. You're doing all the hard work. Now, at the end, sometimes what you're feeling now, what you've just experienced was you've finally dug the last little bit, the 2 feet to allow the river to flood all the fields the right way and go down the little trowel lines that you have. And that's the experience of sometimes incrementalism
Mm-hmm.
can feel like you're not really doing anything yet. You're doing work, you're hard, you're tired, and the results aren't there yet. And then suddenly there'll be a huge feeling of results and stuff. And so that's
Yeah.
not necessarily, and that's kind of opposite of like an incremental feeling. Everyone thinks like, oh, just a little bit every time. Sometimes it's a little bit every time, followed by a huge flood of growth, introspection, and realization,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is what you were describing there. Um,
Yeah.
that that was my one point. I did have a second point, but I don't want to really interrupt your jam right now. But it was more like I think maybe I my default was fawning, and I didn't really realize it until we've been talking. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
I felt
I'll
really
give you
called out
time
when
to
I
respond.
when I read about it. I felt really like exposed when I finally got to the level of reading and research and building my understanding, because we have ennobled conflict or fighting. We have ennobled that in our civilization. We've sort of, it's not very noble, but it's definitely, you've got the, you know, if you run today, you can live to fight another day. So fleeing has it has a secondary nobility, but none of the other behaviors of survival have the nobility that those first two have. And so when you find out that what you've been doing is not high diplomatic skill, it's a invention by a child to manage dangerous adults, then it feels like, oh, this has just been cheapened for me. This has just been removed from whatever nobility I was giving it, because, of course, that's reinforced. And it is present when if the audience ever reads Pete Walker's book on complex trauma, he lays this out pretty well, and you can go to his website. He lays it out again. Really talks about these typologies, and he just worked with 4 typologies: so fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And those map nicely onto the polyvagal theories, concepts of the sympathetic and parasympathetic activation states. So, um, with regard to fawning, it's not the it's the primary, but it's not the only. So what you'll see in the typology that Pete Walker talks about is you'll have a primary method of dealing with stress or distressors or challenging people. And then you'll have a secondary and maybe even a tertiary, depending
Yeah,
on how much these get employed. And the fawn freeze is my priority. Our
and I think
experience
mine
in the
was
military,
fawn, flight, fight, freeze.
yeah,
I think was my if I were to order them. Um,
our experience in the military is all about changing the way that we utilize our limbic system and nervous system to go to that ennobled fight, like biasing the ennobled fight response. Because what we ideally would be doing is something to do with aiming and pulling the trigger, something to do with how we use our bayonet, and something to do with how we use our mind and the weapon system that we have to increase the survivability of the people on either side of us and decrease the survivability of the people in front of us.
yeah,
And so that co-option of our nervous system puts into maybe it's different for other vets, but for me, what all it did was create ambivalence, because it means that I
ambivalence about
then
your
would
own
think,
life.
yeah, totally,
That's to be key because you weren't ambivalent about your teammates or your job when you were on the job. I'm making assumptions, but I'm assuming because I wasn't like I cared about the people
yeah.
around me, but I was completely it makes you ambivalent specifically about your own life. Like, oh well,
It makes you in the scenario of the action, and then later on in the postmortem, in the life after this, it means that your default behavior starts to get confused with what our military training tried to give us. So, like I said, fight is not going to be my default from the formative experience. Fight is going to be a default from my trained experience, which then gets into conflict with these other survival strategies, which were the much more natural programmatic approach.
Yeah. So one of the things, I mean, it's really funny you say that because yeah, I think about it now, I think of my primary being to fawn. I actually was
Mm-hmm.
really good at, impressions and things like that to
Mm-hmm.
entertain my parents. Like, I was very good at doing that stuff. Sorry for the babies out there. Uh, um, but in the military, you go through this process of, I mean, at least for the infantry too, where you're like, oh, by the very nature of your job, especially when you have to go to airborne, and before you know it, I'm jumping out of planes, and I'm not necessarily afraid of heights. I'm afraid of heights like everybody else is afraid of heights, as in heights is scary. I had a healthy fear of heights, I suppose. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but you very quickly start to really actively devalue your life because you need to convince yourself, like, well, for me to override my primary systems, um, and in fact, your drill sergeants and who your bosses are and your cadre are and your family are in the army, especially as an infantryman, they require you to be in the fight state. That is a
Mm-hmm.
requirement. And so
Mm-hmm.
you override it because if a fawning is the way I'm my primary, then I'm by that very nature, I just do what they want. I'm fawning for them. And so being in that fight state is kind of how you retool yourself, I suppose, to
Yeah.
be in that state. And just a funny thought, being that I was in a LURS unit, I really tried to hit every part of my trauma subconsciously, I suppose, on my military journey, or I don't know if the universe was just like, hey, give it a shot. But I had a severe fear of the dark through all of my childhood, up you know, into my teenage years to like 13 or 14. Unhealthy fear of the dark. I grew up in the woods, very dark out in the middle of woods in Oregon. Oregon's a very dark state as far as light goes. In fact, it's one of the best places to look at stars in the whole world. Um, I read that in an article this year. So, and then I became a senior scout, the guy who leads a six-man unit through the fucking woods all the time at night, all the time. No night vision? No. No night vision. I was the guy who would walk through the woods. In fact, in the Special Forces Q course, doing the night course, land navigation at night by yourself, 25, 20 clicks, whatever it is. Anybody who's done the STAR course knows it's fucking long. It sucks. But you're doing it out at night. I literally was forced headlong into some of my biggest fears. Um,
Mm-hmm.
by myself, my own decisions, and where
Mm-hmm.
my career in the military took me after I failed the Q course and getting sent to a LURS unit, and immediately basically taking that position and maintaining that position for the rest of the time I was in. Um, yeah, and I'm sorry, visitors, if this sounds broken. I'm just reflecting on that and how that overlays with my formative years growing up, and my default F, my animal response mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's utility in talking about how these things play out because we have these working models. I put together a 7 working model document that Pierce and I have access to, and we can refer to, and it brings up these ideas from the different authors and subject matter experts in these areas. Polyvagal theory is one of the 7 working models. Um, the way that attachment theory is one of the 7 working models, for example, and Pete Walker's complex trauma model is one of the 7 working models. And so we can take these life experiences. We can say, let's bring in the Martian anthropologists who would study us, and they would ask questions like, well, why would you do that? That sounds antithetical to life or antithetical to your health and well-being. And we could say, well, that's where you're wrong because this model describes why that would be a default behavior. Or this model describes why there'd be some type of paradox here, because it sets up these autonomic nervous system states that require us to then behave in these ways. And so you you you're just adding color and detail to why those different theories or models for human behavior make sense, or why they might describe what we were doing as extraordinary to one person's perspective, but kind of pretty predictable to anyone else's perspective who has the models to work with.
It's almost a cruel joke that the universe plays on us that
Mm-hmm.
if you've gone through a lot of complex trauma, the logic behind how your system should work is not applicable. And
Right.
the evidence, unfortunately, is the fact that you're still alive. And that's
Mm-hmm.
your brain's default mode. So essentially, your brain is like, well, I've gotten you to this far. So
Mm-hmm.
the way we did it works. And the way
Mm-hmm.
that anybody else is describing it, we don't, well, first off, we don't really trust a lot of those other people, right? So, like, you know,
Right.
so it's kind of almost this catch-22 situation where I was describing this to my mom because I was like, there won't ever be a cathartic moment with my dad because first off, he's a narcissist, and if you know anything about a true narcissist,
Yeah.
um, they don't give a shit about you. I'm telling
Like
this
they
to everybody.
can't
They
programmatically.
can't.
They can't.
Sure, I'm not going to give them that default because that's just a little too deterministic and
Gotcha.
too easy for them. It's too
I
easy of an
gotcha.
out. But I would say the paradox with my dad. So one, he won't give a shit, and second off, if he did give a shit, he's going to take credit because the better I do, and the 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 better I do in life, the more he's right, no matter what. Because look at me, look all of this. Look how well you turned out. And if you've ever heard someone who's like, "Well, look at me, I turned out all right." First off, anybody who's saying that probably didn't turn out all right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say that right now. I had
Yeah.
that mentality fucking 10 years ago about myself. Oh, my childhood wasn't that bad. I guess I turned out all right. I would talk about my childhood lovingly to my wife and to her friends, and they would look at me like, were you raised in the 19 like the turn of the century? Like you sound like you were
Yeah.
raised in the turn of century America. You're not from this America. You're from America back when you would have had 9 siblings.
Mm-hmm.
4 of them would have died to starvation, cold, a bear, whatever the fuck,
Yeah.
And you were raised very similarly to this with
Mm-hmm.
you and your brother, right? Just you and your
Yep.
brother. So me and my sister. Yeah. So like two of us, but we were raised like that. Like I was on a farm. I was replaceable. My dad had me logging property at 13 and
Mm-hmm.
14 by myself with a
Mm-hmm.
fucking Husqvarna chainsaw out there bucking trees all
Mm-hmm.
day. Nah, he'll be fine. Yeah, if he loses a limb, there'll be other ones, no big deal. But I mean, yeah, so um anyways, the paradox this is a long rant to say that these paradoxes of our life, the logic um doesn't apply necessarily for how things should work because the evidence of the person being where they're at and making it as far as they've gone is counter to that logic. And I think that is one of the biggest paradoxes that we are talking about when we are discussing these
Yeah.
forms of trauma. Um, yeah. So
I want to bring up this idea because I think there's some directionality to this terminology, and then we can move in that direction. And I'm noticing the time is our conversations really just speed by.
yeah,
It's this idea called self-care, and we've been hearing it more. There's media that talks about it. There's our friends will talk about treat yourself, and self-care is about
Aziz
these
Ansari and Donna
yeah
Donna Meagle. Treat
there
yourself.
you go.
Parks and Rec.
Exactly.
I love it.
Yeah. And so um, you probably see the punchline here. They're getting it all wrong.
Yeah.
So, so
That's superficial. Treat yourself. That's as
yeah,
superficial as it gets. I mean, the
yeah.
Parks and Rec is as superficial as it gets for sure.
They're doing a good job of calling this stuff out, but the problem is that many of us are not sophisticated enough to get when it's parody. So there's a concept called self-care, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because it turns out it's not about let's say there's some item of there's a consumer good or some type of item that you've been coveting.
Okay.
So you procure it, you bring it into your life. You've not done self care. You've bought something that is a superficial item in your life that's not anything to do with your state of rest, recovery, and self value. But what is an example of self care is um, that you make sure that you have something to drink in the car, and that you've got a jacket in the car, and that you have the things that your child needs in the car when you get in the car and drive somewhere. Doesn't matter if you're driving 10 minutes or 2 hours. Self care is about addressing the biological needs that we have that when they go unaddressed or unattended to, it increases our state of duress. So self care gets at this idea that we biologically need to eat. So what if we made sure that it wasn't necessarily that I packed my lunch today? That was a good call. I did pack one, but I also in my office at work and in a couple of different places around campus, I've got caches of
I
snacks.
was about to say you got some, yeah, cash
I,
lying
I've got a
around.
soft, I've got a soft blanket in a cabinet. I've got a cache of snacks, and I've got a couple of different things that I could describe as comforts to the human body that that can downregulate an agitated state because they represent experiences of comfort or co-regulation or biological need.
Yeah.
So, and part of what has helped me to fit into the community here at campus has been that people will come into my office distressed, dysregulated. They need to co-regulate. And yes, what am I doing? I'm offering them one of my snacks. Here's my soft blanket. Hold on to this. Sit in my chair. I pull up, I have imagery on my computer screens that is going to be calming because of its color tone and so forth. Like self care is an understanding of our biological needs to regulate our nervous system into the parasympathetic, relaxed, and connecting state so that we can rest and recover. And so sometimes that means that we have what looks like creature comforts in our home or in our car or at work. Sometimes it means that we have, well, in your case, we have definitely made sure that the kids have toys to play with, that there's plenty of diapers, and that there is something for them to eat, no matter what you're doing if you leave the house,
Oh,
right?
yeah, leaving the house when you have kids,
Yeah.
everyone knows this if you do, it's there's no simple we're just leaving the house. Yeah, if you ever
Yep.
need to go to 7-Eleven to go pick something up or whatever real quick, it's not that. You need to make sure there's, yeah, things to change them, food, drinks, make sure they've peed before you've left. They're gonna have to
Yeah.
pee anyways over, you've got
Yep.
extra change of clothes. And beyond that, what you're describing, Richard, to me is not only addressing what you're doing is you're addressing your future human needs, which is actually addressing your safety. So because like you're basically, and there's certain things for me, like I had multiple heat strokes in the army, like multiple. It was one of the reasons I got med boarded out of the army is literally uh, being sent to Georgia from Washington State to go do pre-ranger with 1 day to adjust to the climate,
Mm-hmm.
caused me to have a heat stroke, then getting sent to the desert in Yakima about a month later
Yep.
in 90-degree weather, caused me to have another heat stroke because I hadn't recovered before. So I keep water with me all the like something that is essential that I always have to have around me. I like my wife calls it my binky when I keep,
Mm-hmm.
some canister with water around with me, right? Um, and all of these things are there to not only deal with our immediate safety and our immediate comfort, but make sure, hey, if I get put in this situation where I need to co-regulate with somebody. And similarly, I mean, my wife, she's getting stressed out right now by those kids. She's out there by
Yeah.
herself. She's an army of one versus an army of two. So she's basically, Ukraine, and there are the Russians out there just flooding over her. And she needs American arms shipment to be approved by Congress to go help her deal with the enemy. I mean, my children.
This metaphor is going to really age very well, by the way. There's nothing topical about it.
So, anyways,
And you picked out something that I wanted to stress and emphasize here, and that is that when we're doing the self-care as I'm describing it in this forum, then what is being experienced by our autonomic nervous system is indistinguishable from signals of safety. And and the meta idea is that we value ourselves now and in the future sufficiently enough to make sure that there is a granola bar in the middle console in the car, that there's a change of clothes, in the office because on multiple occasions that's come necessary, that we value ourselves enough to foresee our needs in the future, and that is a reinforcing and ratifying idea of our intrinsic and existential value. And that is a major takeaway I wanted to give the audience at the end of our conversation today, which is when you start considering changes that you want to make in your life, when you really want to get yourself off of this behavior or off of that substance or away from these toxic individuals or whatever your need is to move, you have the insight, it's time to change. There's no step one, step two, step three. That's not going to work for any of this. But among the earliest stages, among the central ideas to all these other concepts we talk about, is this notion of validating that your existence matters. You have existential value, and you are showing yourself that you have this existential value and importance by checking off one of those boxes of, hey, I put new sheets on the bed today. That's self-care. You
yeah.
know what I did? I threw out the old food from the fridge and I put new food in. That's self-care. I washed one dish when I was at the sink today because I value future me who's going to need that dish. That's what I'm
It,
getting at.
dealing with your, yeah, and beyond that, dealing with your bills, your financial obligations on time,
Totally.
doing all those things, because you're saving yourself from stress in the future, right? And,
Mm-hmm.
really, what you're doing is you're trying to do that. I think it's a great stopping point because the next episode I'd really like to get into the idea of contracts and
Mm-hmm.
because what you're describing is setting small little contracts with yourself and like creating a framework of contracts that you actually keep with yourself. And we've been talking a lot about addiction, and I think we'll talk about this in the next episode probably, is the idea that if you have a lot of addictions or you have a lot of unaddressed trauma, that you most likely aren't good at keeping contracts with yourself. And
Yeah.
it's one of the biggest signs of it. I was very bad at keeping contracts with myself, and I'm sure Richard's struggled with contracts in his past as well. And so I think it's worth us diving into what that looks like on the micro scale,
Mm-hmm.
because there isn't a step one. It's much more like, hey, this is how we kept contracts to ourselves. This is how we started
Yeah.
making contracts. Um, so yeah. Anyways, that'll be for the next episode. I really enjoyed our conversation today, Richard. How about you? You have a good one?
I love that we got into really great places with the topic, the content. We covered the things that I wanted to talk about today with regard to, the importance of attachment. Well, we talked about the seven working theories, and I'll
Yeah.
talk about them each time we convene, because each of those different models for the human nervous system are just one way to get a little bit more information about ourselves, to understand other people better, to see different facets or metaphors about the way that we behave, and that the paradoxes in our life are actually not so paradoxical after all, because they actually have a natural history of causes that make them present. So yeah, thanks for asking, and I hope you
Yeah,
enjoyed it as well.
I did. I love it. It's funny because for all the listeners out there who don't know, a lot of times me and Richard will we'll have a discussion. I kind of want to talk about this, or we'll say something about, I'll leave notes to him about, hey, I'm walking around the dogs in the morning, and I'm like, hey, I definitely want to talk about this, not the next episode, but at some point, or then there'll be something where I say I want to talk about this. We have these discussions, and half the time we don't even touch on the topic I bring up, which is awesome. Like, I like that because it just means that we're going with the flow, we're being dynamic, and really we're engaging in the conversation that's happening rather than what has been planned out. And um, I think that that's the sign of really good conversation. Typically, is if it doesn't go to plan, it doesn't go all according to plan, and it feels fruitful and full of value, which it is for me. So yeah, I'm very
Uh,
much enjoying myself.
there's so much about what we encounter and talk about that is the metaphor of the mycelium, the metaphor of the mushroom. What we see on top of the ground is the fruiting body, but the organism is throughout and under the ground and connecting with all kinds of different root systems. It is massive biomass that we don't even see. So
That's
yeah,
so
what you
funny.
bring up
That's a
and say,
really nice
I'd
way
love
to
to talk
say
about this.
the mushrooms are all the dicks out. They're just the reproductive organ to to the mycelium. We could get into mushrooms because I'm all about that life. Super cool. Yeah. By the way, all those mushrooms everyone's eating, including myself, because they're healthy and they're good, and I'm not talking about the special ones, but those are cool too. Um, they're a bunch of penises. That's what mushrooms are. I'm just joking. They're not, but they are reproductive organs. So just in case there's
Fruiting bodies. You could call them fruiting bodies, and then we
fruiting
don't think that
bodies.
we're not thinking about how we're eating a bag of dicks.
But it is funny. Like, I put mushrooms in my Chinese food that I make. I make Chinese fried rice, and I put mushrooms in that, baby. So, anyways, I'm a big fan. All right. Well, fun little jokes aside, I really enjoyed ourselves. We're gonna go ahead and end it here before we talk about more bags of dicks and shit. So, as always, Richard, it was a fantastic time talking to you, and I look forward to the next one.
Likewise. I'll see you next time, Pierce. Signing off.